so I'm here today to do my January reading wrap up. These keep going up a little bit later than intended, but the reviews still stand, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But I have 5 books to talk to you about today, 4 of which I read in January, and 1 of which is a tiny little book that I read in December and forgot to mention in my wrap up because I was at home and it was here and slipped my mind. So briefly, the book I read in December that I forgot to talk about is this tiny little book called Eric by Sean Tan. This is a beautiful little picture book. It is not a silent picture book, it does have words. In fact, some of the pages have only words, but yeah, it's illustrated with these gorgeous little illustrations of this little character, Eric, who comes to stay with a family. He's sort of like a foreign exchange student, and it's kind of about the family growing accustomed to his ways of doing things and the differences in his kind of culture, and it's so sweet and so magical. Honestly, I know it's tiny, but it packs a punch with very few pages, and I would highly recommend it to everyone. It's actually one story that's been extracted from a larger volume called Tales from Outer Suburbia by Sean Tan, which I'm going to have to get a hold of now because I adored this little one. The next book I did have a physical copy of, but I've already lent it to a friend because I really enjoyed it, so I'll just insert a picture here, and that is The Butcher's Hook by Janet Ellis. I've mentioned this in a recent video, in fact, called Contemporary to Classic Book Recommendations, where I recommend you a classic book based on a modern novel that you might like if you liked one or the other. In that video, The Butcher's Hook was one of my modern novels, and you can go and find out what classic I recommended if you're interested. I'll link the video down below, but I really enjoyed The Butcher's Hook. It was a very dark novel set in the 1700s. It followed our protagonist, Anne Jacob, who is a slightly odd young woman. She has a bit of a fascination with things like dead animals and the inner workings of the body, and she falls madly and passionately in love with the butcher's boy. She's from quite a well-to-do background, and this is certainly not a match her parents would make for her. In fact, her father is trying to match her with another wealthy man who she detests quite rightly and does not want to marry. He also is not a very nice person, and she pursues this affair with the butcher's boy. But because of the social impositions placed on Anne as a young woman in this time, and also some of the horrible deeds that other people do in the books, things really start to escalate and get darker and darker, and Anne certainly plays a part in that as the book rolls on. Certainly not for the squeamish, but very good fun. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I felt, but a really intriguing and enthralling read. I then read The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warrener. I couldn't rate this book on Goodreads, and I still can't rate it. I just don't think it requires or can be rated from the perspective of how I rate books, I guess, and because this is the author's autobiography about growing up in a Mormon commune on the outskirts of the United States in Mexico, and it is not a positive experience. This book deals with child abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, the general mistreatment of children, poverty, the extremes of sexism, just lots and lots of horrible things, and it was a really harrowing read. It was very difficult to read, and honestly, just as one terrible thing seemed to be over, another terrible thing happened. But this is a true story of this woman's life, and it did have a very hopeful ending actually after all of that darkness, which of course you have to hope for, especially in somebody's real life. This book is either for you or it isn't. I definitely found it very interesting to read. I think the author did a wonderful job of narrating her own life and all the hardships that she had to endure, and that's pretty much all I feel like I can say about the book. I felt like if I rated it, I'd be rating somebody's life, which just feels inappropriate. The next book though I gave 5 out of 5 stars, and that is Citizen by Claudia Rankin. I read this for the Diversathon, which unfortunately I only managed to read 1 book for. I did start another book, and you'll hear about it in this month's wrap up, but I just haven't been getting a lot of reading done in general recently, and that week in particular was super busy for me. But I'm really glad that I finally picked this one up because it is amazing. You've probably heard this book mentioned. It has been quite hyped and it has had a lot of praise and a lot of discussion. Personally, I feel it was worth every ounce of that praise. It is a phenomenal book. It is a collection of poetry And I'd best describe it as sort of non-fiction poetry, because the poetry is narrating both small and large real life events, all the way from the everyday racism that the author suffers, microaggressions and inappropriate behaviour and being excluded from things, all the way to modern instances of police brutality and modern day lynchings. It is really, really powerful, and I feel like it was channeled in a really powerful way to create these poems, which are just fantastic. This is so wonderful. I think if you haven't read a lot of poetry, this might be a good one to go for, because it has got that non-fiction element to it. It's not terribly difficult to follow. It is very harrowing though. In fact, if you haven't read a lot of non-fiction, I'd say this is probably a great place to start, because it is structured in that poetic form. It gives you an insight into what is essentially a non-fiction topic. And beyond that, I would really just recommend it to anybody, because I think if you aren't reading a lot about topics like this, it's something we all need to be introduced to and reminded of, and I think that is just done in a really, really good way in this collection. I can totally appreciate why it's had so much praise. And I am not doing a very eloquent job of summing that up for you, but I must admit I have been choked with a cold all week, so that is my defence. My brain's still a little bit foggy. But I'm sure you can gather from what I'm saying that I adored this. I will definitely reread this and continue to recommend it to everyone. Definitely one of my new all-time favourite poetry collections. And lastly, I listened to an audiobook, and that was of Masquerade by Terry Pratchett. This is one of the books set in Terry Pratchett's Discworld, and it is specifically part of his Witches series, which starts either with Equal Rights or the Weird Sisters. Equal Rights is almost like a sort of prequel, I feel. It does come before, but the storyline in Equal Rights is very much separate to the storyline of the other 4 Witches books, and the Weird Sisters is equally if not more, a full introduction to the Witches. I wouldn't necessarily say go off and read Masquerade, but if you like the sound of the Witches series in general, I would definitely recommend reading either Equal Rights or Weird Sisters. I really enjoyed Masquerade. It's not my favourite in the Witches series. My favourite in the Witches series, if I'm starting from Weird Sisters, is without a doubt Witches Abroad, which I just think is absolutely hilarious. But in saying that, Equal Rights is one of my favourite Terry Pratchett books. Masquerade basically follows 2 of our main witches. You'll understand why the 3rd witch isn't there if you've read the other 3 books beforehand, but Nanny Og and Granny Weatherwax basically get enrolled in a murder mystery that is taking place at the Opera House in the capital city of the Discworld, Ankh-Morpork. These are comic fantasy novels if you haven't heard of them before, and they are equal parts hilarious and imaginative, and I couldn't recommend Terry Pratchett's Discworld more highly. I've got a whole video on the series if you're interested in checking it out, but this was my first time reading Masquerade because there are still a few I haven't got to, and yeah, I enjoyed it. It was really good fun, and what else can I say really? Those are all of the books I had to talk to you about though, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've read any of these books and want to talk about them, please do leave a comment down below, and until next time guys, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye!